I'm gonna fix that lighting in in a couple seconds here, but I'm trying to get the link to post it on my social media, so just give me a minute here. I know I'm starting a little bit late, but what's going on here? There you go. There you go. Okay. I should really pay someone. I'm just looking at like the thumbnail that I have, and I'm like, I really should just pay someone to make me an actual thumbnail instead of just using like an old picture of me at an anime bar of all places. But you know, that just shows I'm different, right? Hashtag terrible pastor. I don't know why, but I think my internet's acting a little bit slower than usual today, so. Let's just put that away. Let's whip up my notes. Okay. We got a lot for today. Today's got a lot of notes. I'm gonna need these. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Samuel. And today, we're going to be starting from 1 Samuel chapter 8. And, you know, this is where many people know the story, but in my mind, I tend to think that many people miss that really the crux of the theme that is going on in the book of Samuel is actually found in chapter 8. And so that's where we're going to be starting today. So we're starting off big today. If you want to follow in our reading today, you can just whip up Bible on BibleGateway.com or use the Bible app or something. And I'm using the New International Version. And I know you guys probably notice I take like a little verbal liberties when I like read it to you. But that's more me having fun with voice acting than anything. Okay, this is way too bright. There you go, that's better. Before I make myself go blind or something. Okay, I'm gonna turn this one up a little bit then. Okay. Not that much better. Anyway, yeah, so I'll be reading from the New International Version if you want to follow. And I encourage that you do. I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just dive right into it. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, we would really see the heart of our need for you and our need for a savior and our need for your salvation in our lives. And I just pray that that would be something that would really resonate with us as we read through the book of Samuel. And I just pray that your message does not fall on deaf ears, but rather we would really listen to what you have to say. I pray this in the name of your son Jesus. Amen. Alrighty. So, chapter 8. Oh, this is a good one. So just to kind of do a where we left off. So really for chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, we get this kind of origin story for Samuel and some of his younger years. And even though like for the first half of the stuff we've read, or sorry, the second half of the stuff we read, of course we also deal with a lot of this transition phase between Eli, the priestly order under Eli, which became corrupt because his sons were pretty terrible human beings, to Samuel, who was a good judge and prophet for the people. But unfortunately, that was not good enough. And even Samuel, Samuel's not this perfect human being, as we'll see, that he falls into a similar camp as Eli does and doesn't quite do a good enough job with maintaining order in Israel. And so that is kind of where we lead up to at the beginning of chapter 8. Which is what we're just going to start reading, because I'll have a lot more to say once we actually start reading, once we actually read chapter 8. So when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the second of his was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "You are old now, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt unto today, forsaking me and serving other gods. And so, that is what they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know that the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. And Samuel said, crap, what voice did I give him? I think I gave him the David Hayter voice. My David Hayter impersonation. Okay, here we go. And Samuel said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and his attendants, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and of yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us, and to go out before us, and to fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people were saying, he repeated it before the Lord. And the Lord answered, listen to them, and give them a king. Then Samuel said to the Israelites, everyone, go back to your own town. So, yeah, chapter 8. There's a lot of content in this chapter. I'm trying to put this down without it making a mess. So there's a lot that happens in chapter 8, right? So we have this massive time jump. Samuel's an older man now. Whereas, like, when we read his little adventure in chapter 7, he might have been like maybe his 30s, maybe as old as 40. But now he's like well beyond that. He's probably like 50s, maybe 60. As he has adult sons who are now the judges of Israel, but these guys are doing a real bang up job, right? Like, they're corrupt, they accept bribes and perverted justice, as the Bible would word it. And so these guys, not good guys, right? But Samuel still allowed this to happen. So in a funny way, he's not that different from Eli. But it's one of those things where, and if you pay attention to stuff like various church documents, like the Nicene Creed is a good example of this, where the Nicene Creed actually tries to avoid nepotism. If you don't know what nepotism means, it in a nutshell means like you do favors because of like how you're related or acquainted with each other, right? So, for instance, as we see in the book of Samuel, Samuel appointing his sons to be judges because they're his sons, right? Whereas, like, see, in modern day, we try to avoid nepotism. And if, let's say, we do a hiring process, you don't just hire your cousin because your cousin's like, because you like them, right? But you hire people who are at least it should be, based on their skill, right? Although I have seen some hiring process that did not hire people based on their skill. But, that's kind of the idea that we moved as modern people. But in the ancient world, this was kind of a common problem, right? Where a lot of people were promoted to leadership because of nepotism. And this would often lead to easy corruption, right? Because you don't know if just because like their family doesn't automatically, make them qualified, right? And so that led to all kinds of problems, first with Eli and now with Samuel. And of course, this is one of those other things that like the idea of a monarchy is problematic, right? Because it's all nepotism, right? The next king after a current king would just be the next in line, blood related, right? And so this is an interesting thing to pay attention to. That, I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us, but you're not sure if like, okay, this is still too bright. Okay. You're not sure if the idea of having a king fight for the people, was a good idea, right? Because, the Israelites get on like Samuel's case at like, well, you can't just promote your sons. Your sons are crap, right? So give us a king to lead us. But it's like, have you guys thought this through? You know how like kings, when they promote the next in line is gonna be, their own family. Like, have you actually thought that through? Clearly, these guys didn't, right? And so the funny thing, though, is that the Bible points out that the people must have been aware that nepotism is part of royalty, right? Because they're like, well, why don't we be like other nations, right, and have a king? And so they must have known this kind of system, was the way people operated, which just begs the question, right? Like, well, I mean, it doesn't really beg the question. It's kind of rhetorical, right? It's like, did you guys think this through? Not really, right? But of course, There's something else that's interesting underneath this, and how do I put this? See, I'm like, I have to kind of refer to someone and no proper dues, but I do this all the time, I guess, because small channel, whatever. And you can look this up yourself and give these people their YouTube views or whatever. But so I was watching like Dennis Prager, right? And he makes this interesting point about how like people don't want to be free. That's not in our human nature. We don't want to be free in our human nature, contrary to like, or let me put it this way, to kind of take a spin on Prager's words. The idea of freedom is just a privilege that we've had in North America. So the idea that like, oh, we exercise freedoms in a place like Canada or the United States, that's actually a privilege that we've adopted from like, the founders of the United States and of Canada, right? The idea of, to be our own people, as opposed to just being parts of the British Crown, right? It's an interesting idea here, talk about monarchies. But like, oh, hello, Mischief. Hang on, let me just put her here, let her fall asleep, so I can keep. Shh, not now. I'm doing videos, Mischief. Go sleep. So anyway, where was I lost my train of thought for a second there. Okay, so the idea of freedom is actually a privilege that we've inherited from like ages past, when like Canada and the U.S. were kind of founded, right? Because they were kind of founded on the idea that they could be their own people, right, as opposed to just being subjects of the monarchy, right, of the British Crown. I mean, America fought a big war over it, right? But the idea was that people wanted to be free, right? And of course, that's a prevalent idea, at least for the last couple of centuries. That's kind of, one of those things that like there's a lot of contention in 2021, and whether the 21st century really believes this same idea of freedom. Of course, my critique would be that I think we've adopted a very skewed idea of what freedom actually is. Because, and that, or let me backtrack. We've adopted the wrong idea of what freedom is, and that has made us backtrack as to pursuing real freedom and how our country can be a free country, right? So, you think of like, when I was a kid, and when you were a kid, you probably had this too, especially if you had siblings, right? I have an older sister, and sometimes she does like really, she's just annoying. She just does things that are really stupid and annoying, right? And little older siblings pick on younger siblings. This kind of comes with the territory, I guess, right? And my sister, tried being smart ass, and every time, I'd be like, like leave me alone, like stop, whatever annoying thing you're doing, and she'd be like, it's a free country, right? And in a funny way, that's kind of the sense of freedom we've adopted in the 21st century, which is the wrong kind of freedom, right? The idea that freedom is just I can do whatever I want, including be a ginormous asshole to you, right? Sterling Cox asks, do you take questions about the Bible? Yes, I do. So yeah, just throw them in the chat. But of course, I'm still going through the book of Samuel and talk about themes in it. But anyway, back to my illustration. So what does this, the wrong idea of freedom have to do with, or sorry, where was I going with this whole freedom idea? Well, Dennis Prager made this interesting point about how, like, people don't want to be free, they want to be taken care of, right? And he used the illustration in Exodus where after the Israelites left Egypt and they were wandering around in the desert, and when you're wandering around in the desert, it kind of sucks, right? The Israelites started complaining about, like, oh, take us back to Egypt, we had meat there and whatever, right? And so the Israelites were less concerned about God making them free, but rather that they were eating meat, right, in Egypt. Well, we read in the book of Samuel the same kind of thing happens, right, where the people want to be taken care of. And you read it here in chapter 8, right? They're like, have a king to lead us and fight our battles for us, right? Of course, our modern idea would be, no, we fight our own battles, right? That's the sign of independence. You fight your own battles, right? At least ideally, that's how we believe we should live, right? That I can fight my own battles. But you see here with ancient Israel, and of course there's some, like, I don't want to sound like I'm mean to the ancient Israelites, that, like, oh, you guys are wussies not wanting to fight your own battles. I mean, they had reasons to want to have a leader fight for them, right? And why we develop modern militaries, right? Because one, not everybody wants to fight. Not everybody is capable of fighting. The prospect of fighting is scary, right? Especially when it's like, literal warfare that we're dealing with, right? People, the prospect of fighting other people to the death is a scary thing. And if you've ever been in a fight where your life could be on the line, and I can speak that being true in my life, if you've ever fought where your life depended on it, is a scary thing, right? So of course, I can sympathize with the Israelites. We're like, give us a king to fight for us, right? And so that's an interesting thing to think about, why the Israelites were behaving this way. Sterling Cox asks, who wrote the book of Samuel? If you watch my earlier videos, I actually went into great detail in this, but I'll kind of give a quick answer. So the person who most likely wrote the book of Samuel was actually his successor, Nathan. And low-key, I think Nathan is actually pretty badass. Nathan is a prophet that appears in 2 Samuel. And we know that Samuel did not write the book of Samuel because he dies halfway through his own book, right? So he obviously didn't write his own book. It is most likely Nathan who wrote the book of Samuel. And what Nathan's main objective was to maintain the revelation that God gave to Samuel, which I will get into in a little bit. The main revelation that God gave to Samuel. And that's why the book is called the Book of Samuel. Even though if you actually read the Book of Samuel, it's really a tale of two kings more than anything. But what Nathan does a really good job of is he maintains the integrity of a central theme that's found throughout the Book of Samuel. So that's kind of, I mean, that's a great transition point too, Sterling. So I hope that answers your question. The prophet Nathan is most likely, well, he's most likely the person who wrote the original book of Samuel. What I mean by that is most Bible scholars also agree that parts of the Bible had been edited post the Babylonian exile, which would be like what? Like 400 BC? Maybe a little earlier? Something like that. Well, anyway, in the book of Ezra, and the Bible even tells you this, so you can't say like, oh, you're presuming these things. But yes, we do know that parts of the Bible were clearly edited by the priestly order during the time of the book of Ezra. But if you wanted to like make an answer of who wrote the original script, if you will, of the book of Samuel, it would be the prophet Nathan. That's the most likely scenario. So, I've been keeping you guys kind of, on suspense here of what is this great revelation that God gave to Samuel, and what was it that Nathan was trying to maintain the integrity of as he read through the book of Samuel. And yes, I'm going to make the claim that you can actually find the answer to that in chapter 8, which is pretty early considering that, you know, the book of Samuel, First Samuel has like 20 something, let's say like 20, almost 30 chapters, something like that. And Second Samuel has like about the same, right? So it's like 60 chapters between the two books. And you can find the main theme here in chapter 8 of First Samuel, which is pretty early considering, right? And that theme is, I'm going to read it again. But when they said, this is verse 6 by the way, when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but it is me as their king they have rejected, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt unto this day, so on and so on. So the claim I'm going to make is that the real theme of the book of Samuel is this revelation that God gives to Samuel, and that is only God can be king. Right? Now at first, we kind of see, you know, you don't think that's all that relevant here, because we don't see, like, how do I put this? I'm trying not to cheat and use, like, the Book of Kings as, like, a case in point, right? Because that happens later on. But, you know, as the Age of Kings occurs in ancient Israel, and like everyone else, there were a lot of failings, you know, among the monarchs. Just like, you know, every other civilization and throughout time, right? You know the old saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so God gave a warning, well, not to Samuel really, but to us and to all people. I mean, I guess through Samuel, right? Samuel's the one who kind of reminds us of this truth, that only God can really be king. And so that, I mean, that would be the logical extension of how do we deal with everything. Every human system is easily corruptible, right? So I was watching this video on this person was kind of giving a critique about how a lot of conservatives tend to defend capitalism. And the reasoning is fair. We're like, okay, conservatives defend capitalism because socialism is worse, which is true. But at the same time, that doesn't mean capitalism is good, right? Capitalism is bad for its own reasons, right? But as the person said in the video, and correctly so, was that, well, any system that you put humans in charge in is going to be corrupt, right? You think of like the principles of, you know, socialism, and how like, oh, you know, it's about people sharing and people, you know, the wealth not being like all hoarded by a small minority, which sounds good on paper. But as soon as you put human beings in charge of that, you know, it's going to go down the crapper real fast, right? And you think of capitalism where it's like, okay, the pursuit of wealth sounds good on paper. But then, you know, you get a few greedy people at the top and they just hoard all the wealth, right? And so that just makes neither of them any good, right? But it's not so much the system themselves, but it's more that the fact that people are easily corrupted and will quickly abuse things. That's just how human beings are, and it's a tough thing to deal with. But you read in, you know, 1 Samuel 8 that God says that, well, only I can be king, and you have rejected that, so you're going to have to deal with the consequences, which is the next part that, you know, Samuel will relay to the people. How can we be sure it's the inspired word of God if we aren't even sure who wrote it? So the idea, Sterling, as I'm, you know, the example I gave in the book of Samuel is that, like, the integrity of a certain idea or the central theme, and many theologians refer to this as the infallibility of the Bible. The idea of that the Bible is infallible means that, like, even if the Bible is edited, or there's some things kind of mixed up in translation, because once again, like, I'm reading an English version of the Bible, but the Bible was written in, like, in ancient Hebrew and then modified Hebrew, and then there was the Greek version, and then the New Testament was in Greek, right? So there's all these translation things, but the idea is that when the when people say the Bible was inspired by God, it's that God gave this central idea, the revelation, and the revelation was maintained. The revelation was maintained despite human languages. As I was just explaining, human beings are limited and easily corruptible, right? That's just human beings in a nutshell, right? You just can't. You just gotta deal with it, right? But the message of the Bible, if the main revelation and message of the Bible is maintained, then that's what people mean by it's inspired by God, because of this central idea that was maintained regardless of language and stuff like that, right? And so, as I'm talking about in the book of Samuel, here we have an example of this, right? Where the main theme in the book of Samuel is that only God can be king. And so the book of Samuel, what it does is it will later tell the story of two kings, a dude named Saul and a dude named David, right? And everybody's quick to praise David because he's better than Saul. Saul and David are actually both good and bad kings, right? For different reasons, right? But because but that's just part of them being human kings, right? They're going to make mistakes. They're going to do things wrong. They're even going to do great evil. But that is what happens when you put humans in charge. And, as I just read in chapter 8, Samuel even warns the people, because God tells Samuel to tell the people, like, okay, tell the people the king's rights. And so, like, what Samuel does, which is clever, and I'll continue on my notes here in chapter 8, Samuel gives this little speech, right? I'm going to kind of do a TLDR of it. So Samuel says to the people, this is what the king will claim as his rights. All your men will serve the king as his military, as his workers, his farmers, everything they labor for, the king has a right to it. And as far as your women are concerned, they'll be his cooks, they'll make his clothes, they'll also serve him, right? Hand and foot. All your animals, you owe the king a tenth of that, and all this stuff, right? And I wanted to make a note about the fact that the Bible refers to like a tenth, right? That the king will take a tenth of your flock, he'll take a tenth of your work. This is interesting here, right? Because it goes back to the theme that only God can be king. So the earthly king, when Samuel is giving the rights of the king, oddly enough, has a right to act like God, if that makes sense. That's what Samuel is kind of hinting at, that this king that the people will choose, right, will act like God, and that is his right, which is a weird thing to think of, right? And that's a dangerous thing to think of, because that technically violates, one of the 10 Commandments, don't make other gods, right? But now we're going to have a king who's going to act like he's God, and he's entitled to do so. Which is an interesting thing, right? And that's why the Bible, even mentions that odd specific detail of the king will take a tenth of your stuff, right? Because we remember back in Exodus, that was the temple tax, right? The tithe, right? A tenth of what you make is given back to the temple, and there's a symbolic giving back to God, and of course you have to provide for the Levites. Now here, in Samuel, the king is entitled to do this. So in a funny way, he's kind of entitled to act like God. And then of course God continues on saying, and when you're tired of this guy acting like God around you, well, don't come crying to me like a little bitch, right? Like, this is what you asked for. Which is basically God's way. God says it in a nicer way, but that's basically what he tells them, right? He says, don't come crying to me. I'm going to be too busy to care. So But that is what you wanted, right? And you know, God allowed. No, don't. And then the answering machine's gonna go off because no one's gonna pick up a number that's not even my local area code. Sorry. Just gotta deal with that every time the phone rings because people keep calling us in the middle of the day, not realizing other people work. But anyway, besides the point. So God was pretty generous to allow the people to. That happened. So going back to, you know, God telling the Israelites through Samuel that like, well, you're just gonna have to suck it up, right? This is what you asked for, so you gotta deal with it, right? And this is one of the things that many people tend to misunderstand about like when God allows bad people to do what they do. It's because more often than not, it's like, well, if you're not gonna do anything about it, right? I mean, shouldn't humans govern other humans, right? If you're not gonna do anything about it, you gotta deal with it, right? And so, in a sense, that is God being fair, because then, I mean, if God were just to do everything for us, then we would view him as tyrannical, right? Oh, why doesn't God let me do what I want to do? Why doesn't God, you know, let these people do, you know, these actions or whatever? Why does God have to interfere with everything in my life? Why can't I make my own choices, whatever, right? But of course, you know, you don't even need to believe in God to think this, but all choices have consequences, right? That's just the way it is. And so, unless you're going to go into the camp that you believe that there's no such thing as free will, but then that would be really depressing because then any and everything you do has no meaning because you did not pre-decide that. But that is not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that we can actually choose, but unfortunately, that's a very heavy responsibility, right? If you choose badly, you're going to have to deal with it, right? And you can't use God as a magic like reset button. It doesn't work that way, right? You live with your bed of nails. Or you sleep in your bed of nails, I guess is the expression more accurately. But Samuel is just laying it down for the people, right? This is what you want. You want a king? Your king is going to act like God, and when you come crying to God, he's not going to care. Too bad. You got to accept your decisions. You got to accept the consequences of your choices. But of course, verse 19 gives us, the haha moment, and the people refuse to listen to Samuel. No, we want a king over us. We want to be like other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard that all the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. And then Samuel said to the Israelites, everyone go back to your hometown, right? So, the interesting thing here is that the people want to be taken care of, right? The king to go out and lead them and fight their battles for them. Of course, the danger of that is when the king comes demanding from you, you can't say, well, you have no right to ask that of me, right? Because he's also the guy who's fighting for you. And before, when God was doing that, he did provide for the people, but I guess that was not enough, right? But I suppose it's just human greed in a nutshell, right? It will never be enough, because as human beings, we're greedy. So yeah, that's kind of the most, with me making that claim of like, okay, the main theme of the book of Samuel is that only God can be king. As we go through every chapter from here on out, I want you guys to really pay attention to that, right? Only God can be king. And we can observe how other people act like kings, or other kings, if you will, that don't act, you know, in the people's best interest, right? Because as we read through the story of Saul and David, you'll see that there are times where, they don't act on the people's interest, and they don't even act with God's interest. They just kind of do what they want to do, and it ends up shooting them in the foot, right? And that's the reason why they're bad kings, right? But of course, on the one hand, yeah, they're bad and they led to all this corruption. But on the other hand, it's like, well, they're only people, right? But if you use the excuse that they're only people and people make mistakes, it just is a case in point of, well, only God can be king, because only God is beyond such moral failings, right? Of course, that doesn't mean, that we can have compassion on these guys as they fail as kings. As the opposite is true. You should not only feel compassionate, but you should be empathetic, because in a lot of ways, if that were you, right, in this position of leadership and power, you would not be that different, right? But once again, that's us being human beings. And with that being said, there's something funny where you look at any kind of influencer, you look at anyone in like a leadership position, you think of like easy examples to poke at are like the American presidents, right? In the last number of years, we had some interesting characters. But the idea is that like it's so easy to just like slam these guys and all the stuff they did wrong. And every president has done things that are wrong because they're people and they make mistakes, right? They're not perfect. They're not God. They can't do everything, right? As a matter of fact, like most normal human beings, they actually can't do a lot of things, right? And so I think that's something where people tend to forget, to be compassionate and to be empathetic and to be understanding, right? Because, it's one of those funny things, and then, to throw that little ironic twist, it's so easy to say, like, it's so easy to say to someone else, why don't you try living in someone else's shoes? But then, like, here you are throwing judgment on, weak leaders because, well, if that were you, you wouldn't be that different, right? I mean, hindsight is 2020, but at the same time, if it was you at that moment, at that time, you would not have behaved that differently. And I think that's something we need to be graceful of. But all the more reason that we need a savior. We need God to deliver us. We need God to save us from our human weaknesses and our moral failings, because clearly we can't do it ourselves, right? That's kind of what the Bible gets at. And I want you to pay attention to that, that reality as we read through the book of Samuel. Because, that is the crux of the message God is giving to the prophet Samuel. And for us to understand as modern readers as we read through the book of Samuel. Oh boy, that was a lot. That was a lot to say. So before we read chapter 9, I'm just going to take a short break, drink some water, clear my throat a bit. Alrighty. Have you guys ever watch this on a playback? I kind of like leave these empty moments in between videos. Or sorry, in between chapters, so that you can pause it manually. I mean, there's one way of like just doing like a chapter, like a video for a chapter, and then like, right? But then yeah, like I'm like uploading like tons of videos. But maybe that's another way of doing things. Maybe we'll do that for a future book. But I do kind of like these reading streams, and some live interaction. Right? You guys can always ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Right? I don't claim to. I mean, I just claim to be someone to help you. Right? Not some kind of wizard. I mean, if only, right? Like, if only. But I'm just here to kind of help you guys get a clearer understanding of the Bible. It's kind of my job, I guess. Anyway, let's start chapter 9. Just gotta look at my notes, scroll my notes a bit. Okay. Chapter 9. Now there was a Benjamite, a man standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeor, the son of Bechorath, the son of Ephia of Benjamin. Ah, these tough names. Anyways, Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. Now the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost, and Kish said to his son Saul, "Take one of your servants with you and go look for the donkeys." So Saul passed through the hill country of Ephraim and through the area around Shalisha, but he did not find them. At that point, you might as well turn around and go home if you walked that far and didn't find them. But anyway, they went on into the district of Shalim, but the donkeys were not there. Then he passed through the territory of Benjamin and did not find them there. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start worrying about us. I kind of ad-libbed his voice there, but that's the voice we're going with now. But the servant replied, "Look, in this town there is a man of God. He is highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take." So Saul said to his servant, "If we go, what can we give the man? The food in our sacks is gone. We have no gift to take to the man of God. What do we have?" The servant answered him again, "Look, I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God so that he will tell us what way to take." Formerly in Israel, if someone went to inquire of God, they would say, "Come and let us see the seer," because that's what a prophet used to be called. "Good," Saul said to the servant. "Come, let's go." So they set out for the town where the man of God was. And as they were going up the hill to the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water. And they asked them, "Is the seer here?" "He is," they answered. "He's ahead of you. Hurry now. He has just come to our town today, for the people have a sacrifice at the high place. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. The people will not begin eating until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Go up now. You should find him about this time." So they went up to the town, and as they were entering it, there was Samuel, coming toward them on his way up to the high place. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. "About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people of Israel, and he will deliver them from the hands of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me." When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Now Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" "I am the seer," Samuel replied. "Go up ahead of me to the high place, for today you are to eat with me, and in the morning I will send you on your way and tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them, for they have been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line?" So Saul answered, But I am not a Benjamite. But am I not, sorry, but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such things to me? Then Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Now Samuel said to the cook, "Bring the piece of meat I gave you, the one I told you to lay aside." So the cook took up the thigh and what was on it and set it in front of Saul. Samuel said, "Here is what has been kept for you. Eat, because it was set aside for you for this occasion, from the time I said, 'I have invited guests.'" And Saul dined with Samuel that day. After they came down from the high place of the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house. They rose about daybreak, and Samuel called to Saul on the roof. "Get ready. I will send you on your way." When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went outside together, and they were going down to the edge of the town. Now Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go ahead of us." And the servant did so. "But you stay here for a while, so that I may give you a message from God." Which has got to be a bit, I don't, the Bible translator who divided these, like, the chapters and verses, totally did a badass job of, like, ending chapter 9 right there, right? As Samuel's like, "I have a message from God," right? Like, that's got to be a great cliffhanger. And a moment of suspense. So now I'm kind of going to talk about the chapter. So chapter 9 is basically we are introduced to this dude named Saul. One of the two kings that I mentioned, right? At least he's going to be told that he's going to be king soon. He's not king yet, obviously. He's just some guy, right? Some surfer dude, as I kind of ad-libbed his voice there. But, just some dude, from some small village, right? So a couple things in this chapter. It's kind of funny. The first thing to point out is just the funny moment where, like, okay, so Saul's dad loses some donkeys. Oh, excuse me. And sends his son to go looking for him, right? And it's funny how the Bible's like, and they went to this place, and they checked over this place, and they checked this other place, and they couldn't find the donkeys. It's like, dude, after a couple of places, wouldn't you have given up? But then again, I guess you wouldn't, because in the ancient world, I mean, I guess it's still true today, but not to the... In the ancient world, it's not true today, right? Because wealth is different today. In the ancient world, I mean, donkey is like their livelihood, right? Like, it's a large amount of money, basically. And if they had lost the donkeys for good, that was a large capital that was gone, right? So, you make a big deal out of everything, right? Which I guess is one of those things about the ancient world that generally sucks, right? People think like, oh, it was simpler in the ancient world. It's like, hell no, it wasn't, right? The ancient world was a cruel and unforgiving place. It's one of those things where you're like, man, living in the 21st century is pretty awesome, right? Because you don't have to deal with half these struggles like in the ancient world, right? Which is just, if you were reading this and thought, like, why would they spend so much time looking for a couple of donkeys? It's like, back then, that was their whole livelihood, right? They probably used it to do, like, farm work, and they may even, use it for, like, goat milk or something, right? Or donkey milk or whatever. They're donkeys, right? They could have used it for work and stuff like that, right? Especially if you're a farmer, it's like your main piece of equipment, right? Imagine if, like, a modern farmer just lost his, like, that huge tractor thing. There's, like, a special name for it. The giant ones that have, like, you're watching those videos now where, like, farming made super easy. It's literally one guy plowing through, like, 10 rows of, like, vegetables with, like, his huge ass tractor thing, right? With the huge blade things, right? It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that back then, right? You had to use donkeys to do it. And donkeys are not efficient or as efficient. Well, Yeah, they're nowhere near as efficient as a giant machine that can like peel 10 rows at a time, right? Just clean it, right? No, it wasn't like that, right? And of course, on top of that, you have to consider other things like how crops were not as easily grown back then like they are today. Thank God for modern agriculture, right? Modern agriculture is awesome, right? But in the ancient world, stuff like having a donkey was a big deal, right? And the interesting thing is that like we can even assume more. Oh, excuse me, I'm yawning now. But we can even assume more that like the donkey was all that they had really, because like we read in other passages where Saul's like, "Am I not like the least in my family? Is not my family the least in the tribe of Benjamin?" Sound familiar, huh? Um, but if Saul, if what Saul says is true, that his family is like the small family of the clan, if you will, then clearly they would have been at the bottom of the bucket when it came to the wealth. And so maybe a couple of donkeys was everything, right? And so as modern readers, we think it's weird that like Saul would go so far out of his way to find a couple of donkeys. But like ancient world, dude, ancient world sucks. And yeah, a couple of donkeys would be like some people's everything, right? I mean, today, what could I make that comparison to? Like how different life was for the ancient world. It's such a huge difference. I don't even know if I could actually make a good comparison, right? But like you think of like okay, here's a good example, right? There's a lot more Uber drivers and stuff like that today, right? Delivery drivers, because unfortunately COVID is a thing. So we do a lot of like delivery, right? Imagine if like your Uber driver, I don't know what you guys have in the States. In Canada we have Uber and Skip the Dishes, right? I think Skip the Dishes is American too. I mean, I think it started in America and then Canada picked it up later. What am I talking about? So Skip the Dishes, right? So imagine if you Skip the Dishes driver, his car broke down, right? You know how big of a deal that would be for him, right? Like that's his livelihood, right? His job is a skip the dishes driver, right? If his car goes down, right? He's kind of not in a good position. He's almost the north side of totally screwed, right? Which would be the same kind of thing with like Saul's dad losing his donkey. So it's not that big a deal that like yeah, Saul would spend like what was it, like 3 days or something just looking for these donkeys, right? Of course, the 3 days thing is also symbolic, but yeah, it was a big deal to just find these donkeys. Then we get to when Saul reaches, where does he go? He goes to Shalim. Oh no, they go to a place called Zuph, and then that's where they hear about like the prophet, right, or the seer. And so the Bible makes this funny note about how like, well, the seer is what people would have called the prophet, but I don't think that's 100% accurate. In a way, you could look at it as like actually there's a bit of a problem with like Israel not being as, or let me put it this way, Israel being more like the other nations already, even without a king. But the seer would have been like a word that was generally used of like some kind of diviner, right? And so in other nations, they obviously had diviners and seers. And then, well, Samuel, as a prophet of God, would have just been lumped in the same category, right? Because I guess he has the whole like seeing the future and stuff, right? And so when the Bible points out that like, well, a seer was just what they called the prophet in ancient times, is not 100% true. Or rather, that's not totally accurate. But the actuality was that, like any other seer and diviner from like other nations, Samuel would have been treated the same way. At least like let's put it this way, right? You think of like if people, who, although as of late, Christian prophets have not had a good track record, but let's say like a prophet, right, living today, and then you had a regular person try to like label, if you will, the Christian prophet. The secular person would be like, you're just like every other fortune teller, right? You're not, right? The person, the secular person wouldn't know, right? And to the secular person, he wouldn't care, right? And so the word seer was kind of like a general word used for diviners and people who could see the future, right? Because there are funny cases in the Bible where it's not just like prophet of God. The man of God is not the only person who can do this, right? We read in the book of Numbers, there's a guy named Balaam, and Balaam is no prophet by any means, but he is still treated in a similar fashion of like, well, he can see the future, and people go to him to tell fortunes and stuff like that. And of course, God does turn the tables and use him to uh, give favorable words for Israel, even though Balaam was hired to speak against Israel, right? And God turns the tables. But the funny thing is that, Balaam would have been a thing, right? And, he's not a prophet exactly, but he's obviously some kind of seer. And so when the Bible mentions here in chapter 9 that, like, well, seer was just a word that was used for prophets, it was more like the better way of understanding it was that, like, Saul and the servant were just using the regular people language, right? And they didn't give they didn't give Samuel his proper dues, right? In calling him the prophet of God, because most people probably wouldn't have done that, right? The regular person would not be concerned with like these proper titles, and would just be like, oh yeah, the seer, right? And then Samuel just kind of like whatever, right? He just rolls with it, I guess. I guess Samuel has more important things to care about than what people call him, right? So that's the second observation. The next observation to make in chapter 9 is, well, there's not a lot of observations. Just the story is actually kind of straightforward, right? Where we get the next sequence of events where like Saul meets Samuel, and Samuel's like, ah, you were the one God told me about. Okay, so I'm gonna have this feast. And it must be a big deal because it's like 30 guys all eating together, right? And of course, the Bible gives a symbolic image of like Saul is kind of already like a king, where like Samuel gives him the best seat, the head seat over 30 people. And these are all like Samuel's invited guests, right? So these guys aren't like, I mean, we assume these guys are important, right? Because if, Samuel being the seer is like the town big shot, right? And remember, Samuel isn't from Zuph, he's from Ramah, right? So, I mean, I guess Zuph and Ramah weren't that far apart, and Samuel just kind of, goes from like the town districts. But, you know, if Samuel were to go to Zuph and then he invites people, obviously he's going to invite all these, the big shots, if you will, of the Zuph community. And so for Saul to sit at the head of the table, he's already kind of placed on this like higher position, right? And I just wonder like what was going on in Saul's head, like, this is interesting. This is a weird feeling, being at the head of the table. Because remember, if what Saul said is true about like him being the lowest of his family, he often, would get the seat from the opposite side of the head of the table, right? You would get that spot. Whereas like here, Saul is like at the head of the table, right? So he's where like the leaders of his community would sit. And so I wonder if Saul like was like suspicious, like, this is different. This is weird. Never expected to be sitting at the head of the table with all these other like interesting characters, right? But I mean, the Bible doesn't really tell us much about that. I mean, we don't get to see Saul's thoughts, but I wonder. I would think about like I wonder what Saul was thinking, right, in those moments. Just like, oh, this is interesting. And of course, like Samuel has like this special like lamb chop piece or something, right? The thigh piece, the good part, right? And he's like, I have this part saved for a special guest, and that guy's here, right? And it's like the other thing too is that like if Saul's been walking around for like 3 days with his servant, obviously like he's kind of in regular street clothes or whatever, right? He's not like dressed for a banquet, right? So it's just kind of funny. I just say like trying to paint this picture in my head. It just would look funny. We're like, yeah, Saul, this regular looking guy. I gave him the surfer voice, so like some surfer dude sitting at like the head of the table when everyone else is like in suits, right? I don't know. I just think it's kind of funny, and I wonder if like Saul was like, this is weird. Because if that were me, I'd probably think that's weird too. But maybe. Then we finally get moving on. We just get the part where Saul's like, okay, or sorry, not Saul. Samuel's like, okay, Saul, you don't have to worry about the donkeys, and I can just tell you that they're fine. They've been found. And so like, there's your word of God. Wow, that's the most reassuring thing, right? Okay, they're found. No need to worry, right? Like, it's just kind of funny where like Saul walks all this way, and then like, what does the prophet have to say? Oh yeah, no big deal. They're already found. It's like, right? I don't know. If I were Saul, I'd probably be like, can't believe I walked all this way. But of course, as Samuel leaves us at the end of chapter 9, Saul's not going to walk away empty handed, even though he just probably had the most anticlimactic word of God given to him in concern of what he was looking for, right? The donkeys. And the most anticlimactic, yeah, they've already been found. Just chill. I don't know, I just found that kind of funny. So that's chapter 9 in a nutshell. Moving on to okay, we're going to read 2 more chapters today. We're going to read chapter 10 and chapter 11. I think that's a good place to end. So chapter 10. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. And they will say to you, The donkeys you set out to look for have been found. And now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He is asking, What shall I do about my son? Then you will go on from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. And 3 men going up to worship God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. As opposed to what? Refusing free food? After that, you will go to Gibeah of God. Although, there was that one general who accepted free food, and that did not go over for him very well. So, there's that. Verse 5. After that, you will go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you will meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place with lyres, timbrels, pipes, and harps being played before them. And they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. Now go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what to do. As Saul returned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. When he and his servant arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he joined in their prophesying. When all those who had formerly known him saw him prophesying with the prophets, they all asked each other, "What is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" Now a man who lived there answered, "And who is their father?" So it became a saying, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" After Saul stopped prophesying, he went to the high place. Now Saul's uncle asked him and his servant, "Where have you been?" Looking for the donkeys," Saul said. "But when we saw that they were not found, we went to Samuel." Saul's uncle said, "Tell me what Samuel said to you." And Saul replied, "He assured us that the donkeys had been found, but he did not tell his uncle what Samuel had said about kingship." Now Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to them, This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel up out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God, who saves you out of all your disasters and calamities. And you have said, No, appoint a king over us. So now present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. When Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes, the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was taken. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, Has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, Yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies. So they ran and brought him out, and he stood among the people. He was a head taller than any of the others. And Samuel said to all the people, Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all people. And the people shouted, Long live the king! Samuel explained to the people the rights and duties of kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people to go to their own homes. Saul also went home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. But some scoundrels said, How can this fellow save us? They despised him and brought him no gifts. But Saul kept silent. So chapters 10, the woo moment where Samuel just tells Saul, You're going to be the king of Israel. God's going to make you the leader. And you're going to govern his people. Excuse me. Yawn. And he's like, You're going to be the leader. And Saul's like, Okay. And Samuel, tells him like this interesting stuff where it's like, you're going to go to these places and this weird stuff's going to happen to you, right? But you just roll with it, guy. Because God is doing something, right? And of course, for Samuel to tell Saul, some stuff that's going to happen in the future, the whole point of it was to confirm to Saul, probably Saul's disbelief that he was going to be king, right? Because I love how the story begins, where like, it starts with Samuel pouring the oil on Saul's head, which is part of like a anointing thing and a ritual of like, how do I put it? The fact that Saul is a master of some kind, right? A master, and I use that loosely, right? Because the idea of like a master or a head over someone. This is oddly used in like marriage rituals in Jewish days, and before people go like the patriarchy, women, the wives would do this to men. They would pour an oil over their head, right, as like a symbol of his like lordship, right? And then of course we see throughout the Bible that kings will get anointed with oil, and the idea that it's their lordship, and that's the reason why they do it, right? Is this symbol, which is weird, right? Because like if you think that's kind of nasty, just pouring like, well, I guess olive oil is not too bad, but then at the same time you're also wasting good oil. But like, you know, pouring oil on someone's head, right? And it's a sign of like their lordship over other people, right? And so there's an interesting thing that happens here with Saul, right? And Saul's probably wondering like, what the hell's going on here, right? Um, with being anointed. But then, of course, Saul is likely in a state of disbelief, and I mean any person would be if someone poured oil on your head and said you're going to be like the governor of God's people, you're going to be king. Like, that's probably the most bizarre thing he's heard all week, right? And so the prophecy stuff that Samuel tells him, and it's one of those like things about prophets that people make a big deal of, where it's like, well, when prophets prophesy things are supposed to happen, or else they'd be a false prophet. And yeah, that's a pretty good litmus of testing a prophet, right? Is do your words come true? But then, of course, this is for the prophesying is for Saul's benefit, right? For Saul to believe all the stuff Samuel just said about like you're gonna be king one day. Probably the most ridiculous thing he's heard, right? But the prophecies are designed to verify to Saul that Samuel's words are true. Right? So I kind of like how like the Bible, like when Samuel's telling Saul this stuff, he like goes into this details, like, well, you're going to go to this place, and then these guys, and they have this, and they're going to give you this, right? And it's all like very specific, but once again, that's the whole like how prophets work, and the fact that Samuel can see the future and stuff like that, right? Because Samuel has magic powers, right? I mean, it's kind of his job as the prophet, I guess, and so he can do miracles, right? Which is funny because another thing is that like you actually don't see Samuel do a lot of miracles compared to other prophets. Like he's no Moses, right? He's no Elijah. You actually don't see Samuel do a lot. He only had like the one, right, back in chapter 7, where like when he prayed there was a storm, right? And God had God manipulated the weather for him. That's like the only miracle that like Samuel kind of does, right? But here's his other like main profit points, I guess, is that he predicts all these actions. And of course, the funny thing is that later in chapter 9, the Bible just does this throwaway sentence of like, yeah, and then these things happened. And then like no commentary on like, did the Bible not like give us Saul's reaction? Like, no, nothing. Just as, yeah, this happened. All right, moving on, right? I just kind of found that funny. And then of course, there's this whole part where when all the people of Israel are assembled at Mizpah, right? And it's interesting that it's at Mizpah, right? Well, Mizpah is obviously a mountain, so a high place, right? Of course, places being higher up, this idea that like closer to God, right? When you're on the mountaintop, but that's an older way of thinking, right? Because one of the important Christian emphasis is that God is also in the low places, right? There is no mountain far, no mountain high enough and no valley low enough. And Marvin Gaye used that line to talk about his love, right? And the idea is that, like, real love can be found in all places, right? That's kind of the point of that line, by the way. And ain't no mountain high enough. But anyway, back to, like, being at Mizpah, and the Israelites are assembled there, and the idea is that God is nearby because it's on a mountain, right? But then, that they have this cast of lots of, like, kings, but of course, like, the game is rigged, right? Because God had already decided that it was going to be Saul, and so they do the whole, like, drawing lots, and then Saul is picked. Go figure. And then the funny part is, like, where did Saul go, right? But of course, like, the Bible kind of makes this kind of joke about Saul. Is like, yeah, he tried hiding, but when you're bigger than everybody and you're pretty good looking, if you're a Chris Hemsworth, it's gonna be pretty hard, to hide among the regular folk, right? You're not gonna pass very well, right? If you're just gonna hide among the regular folk when you look like Chris Hemsworth, kind of thing, right? But apparently Saul tried it and it didn't work for him, right? But and then Saul becomes king. Now I do want to make an interesting observation, and you find a lot of people who only hear, like, the Sunday school stories, and when we talk about, like, David being better than Saul as king, right? Because this will come up. I'm sure someone would bring this up. But Saul has a fair amount of virtues in him too, right? Because once again, we have to be reminded that Saul and David are people. They have their vices, which does lead to a lot of corruption and damage for the people of God. True. But at the same time, these guys had their virtues too, right? That's why Israel was okay with the idea of a king. That's why God allowed them to have a king, right? But, I mean, ultimately, only God can be king. That's true. But that doesn't mean you just scoff at any human leader, because all human leaders are bound for corruption. Because you should also look at their virtues, right? And without getting too political, you can think that with about every like, president, for example, of the United States, and every prime minister in Canada. They all have vices, obviously. Right? Nobody's perfect. But people have their virtues too, right? And God acknowledges that. And the Bible acknowledges Saul's virtue here, right? Where, people were giving Saul shit already. He hadn't done anything yet, right? But it's like, who's this Saul that's going to lead us, right? And then, like, we just had this whole thing where the, toward the end of chapter 10, when Samuel explained to the people the rights and duties of a king, this is verse 25, Samuel wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord, and then Samuel dismissed the people to go to their own homes. So this was official, right? And we read that stuff in chapter 8 about how, like, a king can kind of act like God, or at least it's in his right to, when it comes to his subjects, right? And then there's these guys that are like, we're not going to give Saul anything. Like, Saul was within his rights to be like, the hell did you just say? Like, who do you think you are, right? I'm the king now, right? Saul could have been totally in his rights to just kind of abuse his power immediately. But he doesn't, right? Saul stays silent, and he lets it go, right? Because Saul already knows that, like, well, if I really am king, I'm bigger than that, right? I don't have to act petty, right? I'm not this small guy anymore, right? And so I kind of like that the chapter ends with, like, showing Saul's virtue, right? And of course, the idea of chapter 10 doing this was to show that, like, yeah, maybe even though the people have rejected God and only God can be king, maybe this human king thing, we will give it a shot. Maybe it might work, right? And the Bible kind of gives us this lulled sense of, like, security, if you will. I mean, we already know it's not going to turn out well, like the story of Saul. But I like how chapter 10, at the ending here, it kind of at least gives you a glimmer of hope. You know, it's not going to go down to shit like immediately. And of course, that's something we should give all people, that benefit of the doubt, right? We all know people are ultimately going to fail, but we still trust people. We still are willing to, invest time into people and give them the benefit of the doubt, right? At least we should be giving people benefit of the doubt. Even people that you think, oh, these people don't deserve, you know, my sympathies or whatever, right? Which is a very selfish thing to think, right? But any and everyone gets that benefit of the doubt. And I like how chapter 10 gives you that moment with Saul, right? Even though God did just say only he can be king, but let's the benefit of the doubt. Let's give Saul a chance, right? And the Bible does this pretty well at the end of chapter 10 with showing one of Saul's virtues, right? That Saul, it doesn't act in a petty way. Of course, at least not at the beginning of his reign, right? He starts out as a pretty good guy. Of course, Saul will change, and he does, he no longer is this kind of, slow to anger kind of person, because that's kind of what he shows, right? He's slow to anger, right, in this scene, because once again, as king, it is completely within his rights, but he doesn't do it because he's slow to anger, which is of course something that is often attributed to God, right? That God is slow to anger, right? And so by showing this side of Saul immediately, I think is a really good way of like how it shows that he starts well. Of course, there's the old saying, it's not about how you start, but it's about how you finish, right? And the reason why I want to point this out in chapter 10 is that a lot of people are quick to talk about like how David was a good king, and he was good for his own reasons, just like Saul had good things about him too. But just because you start well doesn't mean that like you're going to end well, because no human being can truly end well, right? Because human beings are weak and we are subject to corruption. It's just the facts of life. And case in point of why only God can be king. But at the same time, you don't just give a guy crap because he's going to end badly, right? We should acknowledge the things that they did well. And so I kind of want to take this moment to just talk about the next chapter will do this for me, right? Chapter 11, which we will end on. But chapter 11 makes a big deal about like Saul's virtues, right? And showing Saul as a pretty good guy. At least he starts out pretty well. And there are some things that were good about him and his reign. So, going on with Saul's virtues in chapter 11, which is where we will end today. And chapter 11 is not that long, but it is an interesting story. So here we go. Now Nahash, the Ammonite, went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace to all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, then we will surrender to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind the oxen, and he asked, "What's wrong with everybody? Why are they weeping?" Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh said. Now when Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. he took a pair of oxen and cut them into pieces, and he sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued. When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. And they said to the Ammonites, tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like. The next day, Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. The people then said to Samuel, verse 12. The people then said to Samuel, who was it that asked, shall Saul reign over us? Turn these men over to us, so that we may put them to death. But Saul said, no one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord rescued Israel. Then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship. So all the people went to Gilgal, and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all Israel held a great celebration. I was deliberating in my head. Should I read chapter 12 as well? Because it's kind of a continuation of chapter 11. We'll see what time permits. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about chapter 11. It's pretty straightforward, right? Where basically, now this place, Jabesh Gilead, is under siege by the Ammonites, right? And of course the story's kind of funny at the beginning, where it's like, the Israelites are like, yo, before, we might surrender to you, but let us make a call to our neighbors and see if they will help us. If they don't, we'll surrender to you. Which, I'm sure it's easy to criticize the Ammonites where it's like, wait, what? Why would the Ammonites agree to this, right? Because if someone does come to rescue, Gilead, Jabesh Gilead, then obviously they're going to be beaten. So why would they agree to this, right? Well, it's one of those funny things in like ancient warfare that like, you ever watch movies like, oh, I can't believe I have to refer to this movie, but Troy, the one with Brad Pitt as Achilles. You think of like, the beginning of that movie, right? The very opening scene. Basically the 2 armies, the Greeks are fighting. I can't remember who they're fighting, but Menelaus's army, or sorry, Agamemnon's army is facing off against his other army, right? And they're kind of standing there, and instead of like, they make this agreement, right? They're like, instead of all of us fighting, right? Why don't we just pick a champion from each side, and whoever loses will serve the winner, right? And so, contrary to popular belief, as unforgiving and rough the ancient world was, people were rational about things, right? So, in the movie Troy, they're like, okay, not all of us have to fight and die today, right? We don't have to kill everybody, right? And we don't want to just make this like, there's no need for all this extra violence, right? Let's just have one guy, let's just have a 1v1 and then like call it, right? In the same way, the Ammonites might be thinking, well, no one's going to come rescue them, so if they surrender, that's better for us, right? Because once again, if you besiege a town, right, you might get other problems, right? Let's say, because, it's not like in Heroes of Might and Magic, as I'm playing on my Throwback Thursdays, fighting a town doesn't take less than one day, right? That's not how things work in the ancient world or in real life, right? You know, when you're besieging a place, it takes you a while to do it, right? And so what the Ammonites might be thinking is that if we besiege them now, right, one of the neighboring groups might just come and ambush us, and that would be worse, right? Because that's another thing you have to consider that's another thing you would have to consider in this kind of warfare, right? If the Israelites made a call for help and they get help, right? Which, as the Israelites would say, well, if we don't get help, we'll surrender to you, right? Of course, there's the whole part where they lie later. Real stand-up guys, right? But I mean, Saul was willing to help these guys anyways. But if assuming that the Jabesh Gilead guys would have been honest, they would have prepared for battle if they were going to get help, and the Ammonites would know this. So they would be ready for any ambush. So in a way, it's not totally disadvantageous to allow this. Of course, the fact that the Israelites lie to the Ammonites later, well, that part you can totally blame the Ammonites. Like, come on, guy, like, should have known. Nobody surrenders that easily, right? Despite you trying to be humane about it, no one surrenders that easily. But that's the rationale behind it, right? Before, people might think, well, why would the Ammonites agree to like letting the Israelites send for help, right? Because the last thing that they would have wanted was to be ambushed in the middle of like a fight that would have lasted several days, right? And that's the thing that needs to be considered. So it would not have been weird at all for like an attacker to be like, okay, you can call for help, right? Because then we'll know if you're going to get help, right? Because if you want the opposite, if you want an example of the opposite, right? The Lord of the Rings movies, right? Of course, once again, you don't really see the mind of the orcs that often. But like, in the epic battle at like Minas Tirith. So Minas Tirith, or Tirith, there's no way the orcs would have known that Gondor was going to get all this help, right? Because, it's not like there was any peace treaty. The orcs just show up and they just start laying siege. And of course, the battle at Minas Tirith lasts for several days, right? You have a few day-night cycles during the battle. And so there's no way the orcs would have known that, first of all, Rohan was going to show up and, the Cavalier charge, one of the most epic moments of the movie, right? There was no way they could have prepared for that. Of course, they too had allies coming, but that's besides the point. I guess that would be more like an insurance thing, right? That you have allies coming to help just in case you didn't finish sieging the place. But they didn't anticipate the Knights of Rohan. And of course, they obviously didn't, anticipate Aragorn and the undead army, right? That just wipes them all out. But you think of like ancient warfare, the idea of like open communication like that was supposed to be advantageous to both sides, right? To give your defense a chance to surrender, as opposed to just going in and killing everybody. Because once again, that would be a lot of needless bloodshed. You could use survivors, or better, if they surrendered, you could have used them for slaves, right? So there's all that like other factors to think about. So it's one of those funny things where like chapter 11 does have that moment where like you think, huh, why would they agree to this? But it makes sense from like a practical, like, oh yeah, we could use them for slaves. We don't want to get too many of our own guys killed, right? So yeah, this sounds like a solid plan, right? To give these conditions of they'll surrender to us if they don't get help. But of course, the turn of the story is that the Israelites lie about it, and then they said they weren't getting help, even though they were, and then Saul just like ambushes them during the night. Speaking of Saul, the next thing to point out is that, like, what's interesting in the story is that, like, Saul is kind of shown to have, like, yeah, he's the Spirit of God on him, right? And if you got the Spirit of God on you, then what could possibly go wrong, right? Which is interesting contrast to other parts of the book of Samuel, right? Where we were reading in, what was it, chapter 4, where when the Israelites were fighting the Philistines and they were using the Ark of the Covenant, and they were like, well, God will be with us if we bring the Ark, right? Kind of in a superstitious mindset kind of way. But because the presence of God was not exactly there, that's why they failed. But then we get to, this scene in chapter 11 with Saul, and the Spirit comes upon Saul. There's that presence of God, which is an interesting contrast, right? It's about the presence of God, leading the people, right? Which, once again, if you think about it hard enough, it's meant to remind us of, like, well, only God can be king, right? Because Saul is only effective when the Spirit of God comes upon him, right? So in a way, God is being king and just using Saul to do his work, right? After all, that's the way Samuel words it, right? That Saul would govern God's people. So even though people have rejected God, God did not abandon the people. God still acts as their king. He allows them to have a human agent, but God still acts as their king and takes care of them. And so the Spirit of the Lord coming upon Saul is a reminder that, like, yes, God will still fight your battles, right? Because it is God who does it. Yes, he can use human beings like Saul. And that's the interesting thing, too, is that God is willing to use people who we know are flawed, right? Or at least in Saul's case, we know he's going to be flawed. But the presence of God coming upon Saul is interesting in that way, to understand that, like, yes, God will still fight for his people, even when they have forsaken him. But that's the difference between God and humans, right? That God is the one who has this unconditional love for us, whereas we as people are just kind of like, yeah, whatever, right? I want to do whatever I want. This leads to Saul having an awesome victory. He defeats the Ammonites. And then there's this part here where, toward the end of chapter 11, in verse 12, there's that interesting part where, like, I guess people were aware that people were kind of giving Saul crap, and were like, hey, remember these guys who were, like, speaking against you, Saul? Should we put these guys to death? And then Saul, showing his virtue, he's just like, no, there's been enough killing today. We don't need to take lives of Israelites. We've just won a victory against our enemies. Like, let's just be happy about that, right? And so Saul is merciful in this case, right? And that's a interesting thing that the Bible points out this virtue about him. I just kind of thought that was an interesting thing to point out, that, like, Saul is actually compassionate here, right? And that this is the promise of him being a decent king, although that's going to kind of fall apart relatively quickly. But yeah, Saul shows a lot of promise because he's merciful, he's slow to anger, right? And that's quite a virtue, right? Because even though we haven't read about David yet, because David shows up later, David is actually very different from Saul in that regard. David is not so merciful, right? David is he's a lot more bloodthirsty than Saul is at times, right? Which is probably why David has a higher kill count that the women sing praises about. Maybe that's why. But stay tuned for next week for that one, or maybe the week after. It depends how long it takes me to get to David. But with Saul here, he's a merciful guy, right? And that's also something that's clearly attributed to God. So obviously Saul has quite a few virtues. And that's something that, makes him an interesting character to study, right? Because while Saul has his flaws, God was able to use him in mighty ways and show his virtues for it, right? But because of that as well, that's also why we should be graceful to a guy like Saul. And, this is not just to people in the past, but this can be applied to us today, right? That, yes, there are many leaders, whether we're talking about the political level or even on a smaller level, like your boss, for example, at work, that, yeah, they're flawed people and they have a lot of things wrong with them, but they also have a lot of good things about them too, right? And you should recognize that. But at the same time, you should also be compassionate because, you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect, right? And so we can be lenient with one another, right? And so when the Bible focuses on Saul's virtues, I think that's an interesting reminder to be like, yeah, don't just be so quick to judge people, especially those who are above you, right? Because it's so easy to do that, right? To be judgmental against authoritative figures and whatever, right? And you know, for some, in some ways, you have every right to. You should judge your authoritative figures, and they should be held accountable. But at the same time, there's also that grace that should be given, right? Because we're all like that. We all have our vices, but we also have our virtues, and we should praise each other for that and admonish when we need to, right? Anyway, even though chapter 12 is a continuation of chapter 11, I'm actually going to end the stream here. My throat is kind of hurting. And I'm actually feeling a little tired, so I think I'm going to end the stream here. I know it's weird that, well, I think it's because, just clicking on a mouse is easier to do than to actually just read and speak out to you like this. That's probably why, I notice on my own videos, I'm always more alert and awake when I'm playing, a video game for 4 hours than I am reading the Bible for 2 hours. Not that because the Bible's boring. It's not because of that, but, I mean, when I have to keep talking like this, it tires you out. So, with that being said, though, this is going to be... Well, before we actually end the stream, if you have questions, you can throw them into the chat. In addition, just do some housekeeping for next week. I mean, it's pretty straightforward at this point, right? So, I'm playing through StarCraft 2 on the channel. I'll be back with StarCraft 2 on Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So that's 5 Eastern. And then if you're somewhere in between, figure that out. So 2 o'clock Pacific time, I'll be doing StarCraft 2 on Monday and Wednesday. And then, of course, on Thursdays, I've been doing Throwback Thursday videos with Heroes of Might and Magic 2. So definitely check those out. Those are regular uploads, one every week for Throwback Thursday, naturally. And of course, next Friday, we will continue in the book of Samuel, starting from chapter 12. And that will be next week at 3 o'clock. So, how's next week looking? 2 days of StarCraft 2. Heroes of Might and Magic 3 on Heroes of Might and Magic 2 on Thursday. Wow. Heroes of Might and Magic 2 on Thursday. And of course, more reading the book of Samuel next Friday at 3 o'clock. So, with that being said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys have a great day, great rest of your day. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And to all you mothers out there, happy Mother's Day this Sunday. I think it's a Sunday. Yeah, it's a Sunday. So happy Mother's Day to you mothers on Sunday. God bless you. And peace out.